I talk about the history of the question of meaning of life. But like first, like few words about like myself. So, who is Frank? When I was like a small kid, when people ask me like, what do I want to do when I grow up, my standard answer since I was like 6 years old was always that I want to be this like world researcher. That was like researcher of the world. That was my answer, like standard answer, as like written here by my mother in some of the pictures. I think I'm like 8 in that picture. But anyway, like when I went to study like philosophy in the university, I realized that actually like what I'm most interested in is not like the world out there, but rather like the human world, like the world that we experience. Like especially I was like influenced by this pragmatist philosopher John Dewey and so forth, who were like arguing that the only world that we actually like can encounter is the experiential world. And then if you like look at the experiential world, if we take that as our study, then we quite soon realize that like the question of meaning is quite fundamental within our experiential world. How do we find meaning in our lives? And because of that, I thought that before I go to other questions, I first want to like solve this one. And so I will like approach the question of like meaning of life both from like a philosophical perspective. I do like some philosophical articles on the topic, and then I'll be like doing like some psychological articles on the topic. But one thing like that I realized that a few years ago is actually that that quite often this like when we ask these questions, or think about this question within philosophy or within like psychology, we look at it from like quite like a historical perspective. We don't like think too much about the history of the question. And the talk I'm going to be giving today is going to be about this history, and it's quite much going to be based on my like book, which is coming out like next spring, which is the name is A Wonderful Life: Insights on Finding a Meaningful Existence. Which is coming like next March it's going to be out, but like almost all of the insights that I'm giving you today are also like found in the book when it finally comes out. But okay, so often when we think about meaning of life, we think about it as like this eternal question asked since the dawn of mankind. As like one recent like paper in psychology said that they started the paper by saying that the eternal question over meaning in life. But actually I think that this is a bit wrong approach to the question, because actually it's not an eternal question. It's quite a recent invention, the whole question of meaning. And by the way, the researcher who said this like thing about the eternal question over meaning in life, they were these Martela and Steger in 2016. So I try to prove them wrong now. And so who was like the first person who like was talking about using the phrase meaning of life? And I think it was already mentioned in the first day. Somebody already mentioned it the first day that like if you look at like the Oxford English Dictionary and other sources, the earliest example of the phrase meaning of life comes from Thomas Carlyle's book Sartor Resartus, which was published in 1834. And in the book there's the sentence where he says that our life is compassed round with necessity, yet is the meaning of life itself no other than freedom. And in the book, there's like these 3 core chapters within the book. It's like this long book with like various themes, but like in the core of the book, there's like these 3 chapters. One of them is called The Everlasting No, the next one is The Center of Indifference, and the next chapter is The Everlasting Yeah, which kind of like describes like this very, very paradigmatic example of an existential crisis. At first there's the everlasting no, like nothing seems to be mattering. There might not be any God, there might not be any values, any human purpose, and so forth. And through this like this doubting everything, the author arrives in the center of indifference where nothing matters no more, and walks through this wilderness, and then like finally finds this everlasting yeah, this like new way of understanding meaning, which like then like enriches the life again. And for Thomas Carlyle, it seemed to be like this juxtaposition between necessity and freedom was like at the core of his idea about this meaning. So like there's a necessity which are about like earthly matters, getting food, getting water and so forth. But then there's also like this freedom which is about like transcending these earthly matters in order to follow one's higher duties. And he thought that in following these higher duties we find the meaning of life. And this book by Thomas Carlyle has been like quite influential. Like one author called it like one of the most influential books of the whole century. And the book's power for the 19th century readers was about addressing of the spiritual crisis of the time. And it was like it was influenced like Emerson in US wrote like preface to the US edition of the book, Walt Whitman used it as an inspiration for when writing Moby Dick and so forth. So it was like one of the books that everybody in the English language world who were talking about meaning would like more directly or indirectly refer to when they were talking about the topic in the 19th century. But it was actually not only Thomas Carlyle who was like kind of coming up with this question of meaning of life at this point. That when we look at like other languages, we find like in the German tradition there was like Arthur Schopenhauer was one of the first ones who was like talking about the question of meaning in German word Sinn des Lebens, and he like mentions it once in his like in his work Die Welt des Willenvorstellung, but then he like talks about the topic quite much more in a later work called Parergan und Paralipomena. I'm not sure if I pronounce it correctly at all, but you can at least see how it's written. And another like person who like was talking about meaning in life, started to talk about the meaning in life approximately during the same time as Søren Kierkegaard, who was like saying in one of his early works, Enten Eller, he was saying that min betragning av livet alldeles meningslös, which translates into like my understanding of life is totally meaningless. And interestingly enough, it seems to me that these three authors didn't like know about each other at the point when they were writing about this topic. So like Carlyle was writing in the English language, Schopenhauer was writing in the German language, and Kierkegaard was writing in the Danish language, and all of them like started to talk about this meaningfulness approximately around the same decades without like being influenced by each other. And like, so here's like just a list of like the earliest use of the phrase meaning of life that I'd be able to identify. And of course, like this is a thing that it is like impossible to like prove, but it's like very easy to like disprove. So like if you're aware of, or if you can find like some earlier examples about this phrase being used, like let me know, because I would be quite interested in finding like earlier versions of it. But like in the German language, one can find it first time in 1793, English language in Thomas Carlyle's work, in the Danish language in Søren Kierkegaard's work, and I checked also Finnish language, and there this elementargetus was like 1846 first time mentioned, at least in like the archives that I've been able to find. And then like one important figure that needs to be mentioned as well is like Leo Tolstoy, who experienced this like quite severe existential crisis in approximately 1874. And then when he was like writing his like one of his major books, like the Anna Karenina, in that book like there's like this character Konstantin Levin, who is like kind of like this alter ego of Tolstoy. That Levin goes through like quite many similar like life happenings that Tolstoy himself had gone through, and Konstantin Levin also goes through this existential crisis where he's talking about the meaning of life and like lack of meaning of life in his life quite much. So I think that might be like one of the points where there's like quite much reaching a broader audience, that it no longer was like only the philosophers talking about the meaning of life, but actually like like the general audience became more aware of the question of meaning of life through this Anna Karenina, which was like a quite big bestseller around the Western world. And Tolstoy also talks about his own existential crisis in his like autobiographical My Confessions. So something seems to be happening in the 19th century which make the question of meaning of life very salient to us. And in order to understand what was happening and what was like different in the 19th century world compared to like the world before it, we might like turn to Aristotle and to see like what was like the thing that he didn't ask in his book Nicomachean Because like if you look at the Nicomachean which is like one of the most influential books in the history of philosophy probably, history of Western philosophy probably. And in the book, like one of the key things that he's like kind of like looking for is the highest human good. So he's like looking for like some end of our actions that we wish for an account of itself. And it's kind of like what he's kind of like trying to identify there is like some form of excellence or some form of virtue that will be unique to being human. So what would be like the virtue of a human being? And he like notes that like the eyes are there for seeing, so the virtue of an eye is clear sight. Horses are there for riding, so the virtue of a horse is about running and carrying the rider well. So like then the question is like, okay, if everything is there for some purpose, what are human beings for? What were we created for? And then he like considers several candidates in his quest, like identify answer. And I'm not like concerned about the answer here, but more about like what he didn't ask, because what he didn't seem to be like asking was like, or questioning at all, was like whether humans have a good or an end. So like he took it like all the time, like as a certainty that of course everything is in this rational cosmos where we're living, everything is created for a purpose. So like everything has some purpose that they were created for. So human beings of course must have like a purpose. So the question is only to identify what the purpose is. But like the thought that like maybe there is no purpose to human life at all, that didn't seem to occur to Aristotle. At least not he didn't write about that topic in the Nicomachean Ethics. And to further illustrate like this kind of the different worldview that people lived before the modern times, I might like ask you two questions. And the first question I'm going to be asking you is this one. Do you believe in electricity? Raise your hands. Who does believe in electricity? It sounds like quite a strange question, doesn't it? Like, like it's not a question that we usually ask because, like, electricity is all around us. Like, my computer doesn't, like the slides that I have up here, they are there because of electricity. Electricity is like, it's a very like everyday thing that we have like all around us all the time. So it's like, it doesn't make sense to ask the question, do you believe in electricity? So how about then like another question? Do you believe in God? That's a question like I assume that in the room there might be like quite different answers to the question. Some people might be like quite atheistic, some people might be have like a firm belief in God and so forth. But still, I guess like most of you will recognize this as like a genuine question. It's a question that it's a question that you most probably have like encountered at some point in your life, but that you probably have like answered or like tried at least like answered in your own head or answered when somebody else has asked the question. And the point is kind of like that, that for us, this question about believing in God is like a natural question. It's something that, we can ask from each other. But if we go back like 500 years ago, the Europeans who lived at that point, the question about God would have sounded just as peculiar to them as the question about electricity sounds to us today. So as like Charles Taylor said, that, belief in God isn't quite the same thing in 1500 than it's in 2000. There are no more naive theists, just as there are no naive atheists. So kind of like, it's in our modern time, it's like you might believe in God, you might not believe in God, but you're conscious about whether you are believing God or not. You have like encountered this question. You know that other people might have a different belief from yourself, and it's like it's something that you are aware of, that you are a believer or a non-believer. And when we go back like in history, like people in Europe in the approximately like 500 years ago, they lived in this more like enchanted world, as like Max Weber used to call it. So like the spirits, demons, magic, God's presence, that was like everywhere. Like sicknesses, storms, droughts, plagues, periods of fertility, all were seen as like acts of God and spirits. And in that sense, like the whole cosmos in that period and like in times before that, it was kind of like a meaningful entity. All parts hang together according to, in some kind of like purposeful way. And existence of God, existence of like this, like spirits and demons and existence of values, that was not a question, but like immediate certainty in a way. And there was like no clear distinction between natural and supernatural, because like in order to have a category like supernatural, we first have to have. I might actually go to the other side then. Yeah, so there was like no clear distinction between the categories natural and supernatural, because in order to have a category like supernatural, we first have to have a category like natural, and that didn't exist at that point, and it took like quite a long time, or only through like the scientific world we became aware of like this category of natural explanation based on the laws of physics and so forth. And that did like before that existed, there wasn't like the potential to not believe in the the enchantedness of the world, because there wasn't like any plan B, any like other worldview that one could go to if one stop to believe in the enchanted world. So one could question like various individual existence of certain, one could have heated debates about existence of certain spirits, existence of God, certain forms of God and so forth, but stepping outside the whole enchanted worldview was impossible, because there didn't exist any other worldview into which one could step into. So as Gavin Human says in his short history of atheism, what we understand as atheism would have been unintelligible to the classical mind. There were disagreements on the nature of gods or their activities, and sometimes even the denial of existence of a certain god, but the notion intrinsic to the modern understanding of atheism of immanence of the world existing quite free of any sort of transcendent real would have been almost unintelligible to them. So like people wouldn't like really comprehend what you mean if you like were trying to like tell about the modern scientific worldview to them. And what was causing this like change in worldview that we encountered in the 19th century and before? Of course, it started already like before that, but like which was like culminated in the 19th century with this invention of the question of meaning of life. And of course, there's like many developments happening. Like the individualism was rising, like humanism was rising, the kind of like the industrial revolution was taking place. Democracies were rising first in France and US and then like across the Europe and so forth. But I still argue that the most important thing for our present purposes is the scientific worldview that was like emerging during this time. For example, like if you look at the Thomas Carlyle now again, and like he starts his book, the first sentence of the book is about like the torch of science. Considering our present advanced state of culture and how the torch of science has now been brandished and borne about, glancing in every direction so that not the smallest cranny or dog hole in nature or art can remain unilluminated. That was the first sentence of the whole book. So he started like with this, that torch of science is now like illuminating everything and like not leaving nothing behind it. And kind of like becoming aware of the scientific worldview when he was like a devout believer in his like youth, but then he went to the university. And the university like corrupted him with the scientific worldview, leading to the situation where he was like describing his existential crisis in the following way: that to me, the universe was all void of life, of purpose, of violation, even of hostility. It was one huge, dead, immeasurable steam engine rolling on in its dead indifference to grind me limb from limb. So that was like quite a powerful like metaphor of like what the encounter with the mechanistic worldview that the science was like providing for him, but like how it felt for him when he like lost like the more enchanted worldview that he used to be embedded within. And we can like find like very similar sentiment from like Tolstoy as well, like from when we look at his like this My Confessions. So he tells us that how he sought in all the sciences, but far from finding what I wanted, I became convinced that all who, like myself, had sought in knowledge for the meaning of life had found nothing. And actually science is worse than not providing an answer to a question of meaning, but it even destroys every possible meaning. So that was like kind of his encounter with the science. And then he like kind of the way he understood human beings after this was like quite similar to what like Carlyle was saying in the previous slide. So you are a temporal accident and conglomeration of particles. It will last for some time, then the interaction of these particles will cease, and you are an accidentally coherent globule of something, and the globule is fermenting. So like very, I got kind of like vivid images of like the way, what is like losing this enchanted worldview, what it felt like for Carlyle and for Tolstoy. And for both of them, like the encounter with the scientific worldview was what like caused this like existential crisis. So like scientific worldview in a way like led to this like idea of like a disenchanted mechanistic universe that follows just the mechanistic laws of science, like this steam engine rolling on. And before that the cosmos was rational, everything had a place in it, and then like of course human beings also had a place in it. And in that sense, like scientific worldview was like what led us to realize that the world might not contain objective meaning or value, and this kind of like was like where the existential crisis was like coming from. So in a way, like this asking about this question of meaning of life is kind of like a reaction to the potential meaninglessness of life. That before that, it was like so implicitly certain that like life had meaning that we didn't even need a phrase for it, because like nobody had even thought about the idea that it might be lacking in our life. But when the scientific worldview led us to question this thing, then that we needed this phrase meaning of life to describe what we are now like potentially lacking. But in addition to science, I think that there's like another culprit to this existential crisis, because like in addition to like becoming like aware that there might not be any meaning of life, we need to also become aware of the fact that we need to have a meaning of life in our life. And here we have like look at the romantics, like early German romantics, because interesting enough now, even though Carlyle Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard, they didn't have like knowledge of each other's work, but all of them like were like quite much like influenced by the early German Romantic work, by works by Friedrich Schiller and works by novelists and other like these German Romantics. And these Romantics, they're kind of like they were kind of like reacting to the, like this disenchantment of the cosmos in a way that they would start like say that, you know, instead of like seeking this meaning or like seeking this value from out there, we should like follow our heart, you know, in a sense, like disregard social norms, disregard like, you know, paternal expectations and so forth, and just like follow our hearts. And as regards love, they had like this like the idea of romantic love that like nowadays is like played out in all possible movies and books and so forth. They were like ones who were like in a way inventing this idea, like this idea that there's like one true love waiting for you, and when you encounter love, like on the first sight, you know that okay, this is going to be the person I'm going to be loving throughout my life, and we're going to be like forever happy. And as Alain de Botton has argued that, you know, the idea of love, the ideal of love that is like romantics like generated, and this like unrealistic expectation that they generated has been a disaster for our relationships and has had a devastating impact on the ability of ordinary people to lead successful emotional lives. And at the same time as these romantics were talking about this like, you know, love, like very like this idealistic version of love, they were also like talking about very this idealistic version of a calling.